You don't have to look far to find a horror game. From big budget blockbusters to whatever indie game is making the rounds on Twitch, horror games come in many different shapes and forms. Regardless of what subgenre it takes, a horror game lives or dies on one thing: whether or not it's terrifying. After all, regardless of its gameplay, a horror game is meant to scare, and as it turns out, that's easier said than done. When done properly, horror games are captivating. They slowly worm their way under your skin, enveloping you in a blanket of fear, before ripping it off when you see the monster slash serial killer slash whatever the scary thing is. In other words, a great horror game makes you want to leave the lights on when you go to bed at night. But when horror games are done poorly, well, let's just say you're gonna want to leave the lights on, not because you're scared, but because you're lying awake wondering whether or not the refund option is still available on Steam. The scary part is, it's probably not. So what makes a great horror game? What makes the scares in a game like Outlast work so well? And what makes the horror of Dead Space 3 fall flat on its face? I'm Camille Salazar-Hadaway for The Leaderboard, and these are the differences between bad and great horror games. Put simply, great horror games are scary, and bad horror games aren't. That's all for our video today. If you like this video, be sure to like and if only it were that simple. It's obvious to say that good horror games are scarier than weaker ones, but that leads to another question. Why are they scarier? To answer that, we're gonna have to talk about horror in general first, because no matter how you're consuming your horror media, whether it be a movie, book, tabletop RPG, or video game, they all rely upon a similar set of principles in order to succeed. How they are implemented changes depending on the medium, of course, but what causes people to be frightened doesn't. Look no further than the Alien franchise. The original film is terrifying and is one of the best sci-fi horror films ever made. Alien Isolation is similarly scary, and it captures the feeling of its parent films even though the medium is changed. So with that in mind, in order to figure out the differences between bad and great horror games, we're gonna have to start by looking at 4 different types of fear. These are, in order, unease, dread, terror, and horror. The best pieces of horror fiction make use of all 4 kinds of fear, so let's break them down. First up is unease. This is the foundation for any good horror media. It is, in essence, knowing that something is wrong or off with the world. Consider Resident Evil 4 as an example. When the game begins, Leon is on his way to a remote European village to rescue the president's daughter. Upon stepping out of the car, it's clear that something is immediately off. The road is too narrow, the houses are dilapidated, and nothing seems normal. Before the player enters the house, it's clear that not everything is right with this world, and it does this without much exposition. That feeling of wrongness sets the tone for the rest of Leon's journey. Each time he moves to a new location, unease is used to establish that just because he moved doesn't mean that the danger is gone. It may be far away, but it's still present all the same. You could argue that unease isn't a type of fear because it doesn't conjure the same emotions as stronger types. Regardless, without unease, other types of fear feel empty. If you don't have a foundation, when scarier things start happening, that fear will not be as powerful as it otherwise would be. It would be a shock, sure, but it wouldn't have the same impact because it would come seemingly from nowhere. Despite being the weakest type of fear, unease might just be the most important. Which leads us to our next type, dread. This is the most common type of fear found in horror games, because dread is the tension you feel when you know that danger is near. You may not know how close it is or what form that danger takes, but you know that something is wrong and it's close. Dread is finding a corpse hacked up or hung up on a wall. The body signals that a vicious monster or killer has made its presence known, but the tension comes from not knowing where that threat is. Sometimes dread is conjured up even when you know where and what the threat is. Despite not being a horror game, Metroid Dread is appropriately great at creating its namesake emotion in sequences involving the EMMI robots. These are nigh invulnerable killing machines that will hunt down Samus if they spot her or detect movement in their range. Tension is created when you're trying to avoid an EMMI's gaze, and there's always the fear that it will notice you and chase you down if you fail to avoid it. Another example of dread can be found in the Silent Hill games. Most games in the series have a radio that emits static when monsters are near. Hearing static indicates that a threat is nearby, but not knowing where it specifically is. That instantly signals to players that is about to go down and prepare accordingly. Dread doesn't have to pay off. Sometimes it's better to let dread build up and pass to ensure that players don't get used to there being a threat behind every door. Throwing the player off once in a while will make the actual horror more scary, as they won't be able to become complacent. Because if players get complacent, it's too difficult to create the third type of fear: terror. This is what great horror games excel at. Terror is the feeling that occurs when you know that something terrible is here and that it's coming for you. It's the knowledge that if you turn the corner right now, you're gonna have to confront the thing that's been leaving bloody trails down the halls. Look no further than the Resident Evil 2 remake for one of the best devices in recent gaming history that creates terror: Mr. X. The unstoppable giant hunts the player throughout their time in the police station and game. Knowing Mr. X is in the station creates dread, but hearing its heavy footsteps creates terror because being able to hear it makes it clear to the player that they're going to have to encounter it sometime soon. And at that point, the player has to make a decision. Are they going to fight Mr. X or are they going to flee? Terror forces players to pick one of those two paths depending on the game. It promises an immediate confrontation with that horror, and you only have a short time to decide which path you'll take. Sometimes you may not know what the horror actually is, which makes the situation even more terrifying because you have no idea what the enemy's capabilities are. While it's possible for terror to be created by monsters that have been seen, it's easier if the threat hasn't shown itself. Fear of the unknown is a powerful fear, and letting a player imagine what could happen if they enter a room where something is breathing heavily is more powerful than knowing it's just a dude with a knife. That doesn't mean that the knife guy isn't scary, just that it's worse to be kept in the dark about the scary thing. This leaves us with the final type of fear: horror itself. Horror is the reveal. It's seeing the monster for the first time. It's the jump scare that comes after minutes of buildup. It's the confirmation that the thing waiting for you in the closet is awful and you should run. Horror is powerful. It's also pretty weak by itself, because while horror makes us jump and scream, it releases all the tension that has been built up. And when that's gone, we go back to either dread or terror, depending on the situation. As a result, horror is best used sparingly. Let me put it this way. If a game featured jump scares after jump scares with only short breaks in between, those jump scares would lose their impact. It's why the other types of fear are so important to good horror games. You have to build up to the horror, and switching back and forth between the other kinds of fear keeps players on their toes. It makes them uncomfortable, unsure of what's going on, and when they are wound up and holding their breath as they anticipate what monster is going to jump up at them, that makes the actual moment of horror that much better. By playing with unease, dread, terror, and horror, a good horror game can create an unsettling atmosphere that drips with tension and opens up the player to being terrified. Each of them are important, and if one is neglected, then its absent rings throughout the rest of the game and makes it disappointing. We're going to take a look at some games to illustrate just what happens when the four types of fear are used both effectively and poorly. But before we do that, there's one other aspect that we need to talk about briefly, and that's whether or not the game is technically competent. Because before we even show off some horror games, we need to be able to play them without having to worry about bugs or bad controls. A horror game could have a great grasp of how to effectively use tension, but none of that will matter if it crashes at random or the monster gets stuck in the environment. It's why we won't be talking about Aliens Colonial Marines. It's an action horror game that is less scary and more frustrating to play due to the countless technical issues and awful AI design. This is Alien, a franchise that is known for being very scary, and yet I can't talk to you about the different types of fear when a xenomorph is stuck doing this.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey.
You could have the best designed scares possible, but none of that matters if the game doesn't function as, a video game. Anyways, back to the four types of fear. To illustrate good and bad examples of horror games that make effective use of them, we're going to be looking at the Resident Evil series. Not because we particularly like the franchise, but because the series has games that both do a great job at scaring players, as well as games that don't. Let's start off with the positive. We're going to take a look at one level from Resident Evil 8 that makes great use of different types of fear. While one could argue that the game as a whole is not as scary as its predecessor, I think most people who played the game can agree that there's one section that is absolutely terrifying. House Beneviento. We start off by approaching a solitary mansion next to a cliffside. Ethan, the main character, has been hallucinating his wife and child on the walk up to it, which already puts players on guard because they're creepy. But upon entering the house, it's surprisingly normal. In a game where most houses are in shambles or otherwise populated by giant vampire ladies, House Benevento is quaint. The lack of warning signs is disarming and creates a feeling of unease that is unlike what the rest of the game has to offer. After exploring the top floor, players eventually make their way to the basement. And still, nothing is really wrong until they step into a room with a doll in a chair. Hold on, wait, there's a doll in the chair? Warning signs, don't go in there, oh my god. Upon interacting with the doll, the lights go out, and the player finds that all their weapons are gone. That's when the dread kicks in, as players now find themselves unable to defend themselves in a survival horror game that is dependent upon shooting monsters in the face. This disarming tactic is used beautifully here, as it instantly creates tension from a mechanical perspective. As players now find themselves unable to defend themselves in a survival horror game that is dependent on shooting monsters in the moneymaker. That's the face. That tension is ramped further as the players explores the basement and solves various puzzles. With each passing minute, different strange events are seen. A painting falls over, a figure is seen walking down the hall, and other generally creepy things pop out to ensure that the dread builds further over time. There are even closets that players can hide in, despite there not being anything to hide from. Something is obviously wrong, but it's not making itself known, and that's maddening. Once enough puzzles are solved, the player has to go down a set of darkened stairs and climb into a well. The entire experience is uncomfortable, but it doesn't shift into terror until the player climbs out and discovers that all of the lights in the basement are now off. And just as the terror is reaching crescendo, well, it's best to just show you what happens next. The reveal of the baby is the horror, and what a monster it is. The 20 minutes leading to its reveal have steadily built up the tension, and when it's seen for the first time, almost all of it is released. But not all, as the player now has to run from it while still solving the puzzles needed to get an elevator working. There's even a second moment of fear when the player has to grab a fuse, only to be confronted by the baby when they try to leave. It is just as impactful as the first time you see it, and by the time the player leaves, you can't help but let out a sigh of relief that it's finally over. This one sequence is a great lesson in how using the 4 types of fear properly can play with the player's expectations and make for a memorable and terrifying experience. A great horror game continually uses them to create a roller coaster of fear, if you will, and the best ensure that the tension and dread never quite let up. On the other hand, there's games like Resident Evil 6 that try to be scary and yet miss the point completely. I could already hear the comments, "But Camille, Resident Evil 6 isn't a horror game, it's an action game." It is, but action horror is a subgenre of horror as a whole, so give me a break. Just look at Left 4 Dead as an example. It's a multiplayer game where the gameplay revolves around shooting hundreds of zombies, but it's still pretty scary. Dread is a constant fear in the game, and anyone who's encountered a witch can tell you that there are plenty of good jump scares as well. But while Left 4 Dead shows how action horror games can be scary, Resident Evil 6 does the opposite. Let's use Leon's campaign as an example, as it's the campaign that's closest to the franchise's survival horror roots. It opens in Media Res in China, with Leon and his partner Helena making their way through a zombie apocalypse in progress. There's no sense of unease to start things off, as you're thrown into the action with little time to orient yourself or establish a baseline sense of normality. It's chaotic, with over-the-top explosions coming at you in short order. There's tension, but it doesn't come from fear. It comes from wondering what the heck is going on. This is a Resident Evil game, where's the spooks? It's a disorienting intro, not the least made better by the fact that when we start off the first level proper, we once again begin with a zombie apocalypse in progress. Resident Evil 6 doesn't give the player any time to create a sense of unease, and that makes it more difficult for other types of fear to establish themselves. What's more, most of the actually scary things in Leon's campaign, such as being trapped in an elevator with a newly infected zombie, happen in cutscenes outside of the player's control. While cutscenes can be used to effectively create fear, in Resident Evil 6, the lack lack of similar moments in levels themselves makes it clear that the cutscenes are being used as a crutch. You are forced to walk at a slow pace just because the game wants you to. You are forced to deal with quick time events because the developers seem to be in love with the concept. By taking away control from players so frequently, it's difficult for any kind of tension or fear to build up because it doesn't let players naturally play at their own pace. And that's only talking about Leon's campaign, as others in Resident Evil 6 are more focused on action instead of horror. The exception lies in enemy design, which are almost always gross and terrible to look at, particularly the bosses, which brings us to a minor point about the difference between bad and good horror games. Bad horror games often rely on revulsion to scare players, while good horror games do not. Having something that looks creepy or scary is good, but relying on it as one of the main sources of fear in a horror game is a lot like relying on the quality of your ingredients while you're cooking. Sure, the quality matters, but if you suck at cooking, relying on the quality can only get you so far. One of the best horror games, both when it comes to creepy monsters and in terms of not letting them be the main source of fear, is Dead Space. The monsters in Dead Space are called necromorphs, and one glance at them is all you need before you start feeling scared. They're gross, disgusting, and you dread having to tangle with them. And they remain that way throughout the game, no matter what form they attack the player in. But they alone do not make Dead Space scary. What makes the game terrifying to play, and definitely made some of the people at the leaderboard put the controller down and take a walk, is that Dead Space never lets up on either its dread or terror. There's always a threat, and more importantly, that threat is rarely the same, or at least rarely comes from the same direction. After a necromorph comes out of a vent, the player will be checking vents constantly, but they won't come out of a vent every time, which keeps the player on their toes. And that's really what's at the core of any good horror game, is it makes the player unsure of what's around the corner. To do that, they have to instill different types of fear and tension into the player. Relying too much on cliches and tropes can kill that tension, as things become too predictable. But those very same tropes can be used effectively. It's why they become common in the first place. A bloody corpse impaled on something is a cliche, but it conveys a message. Something's not quite right. Let's go back to the main question of the video. What are the differences between bad and great horror games? And the answer, it turns out, is more than just one being scarier than the other. The horror games that are truly great are the ones that effectively create tension and fear in players by shifting between several different types of fear. A good horror game is more than just a bunch of jump scares. It's a game that continually plays with and against a player's expectations by making them feel as though they have no stable ground to walk upon. Whether it's running away from some psychopath in Outlast, going toe-to-toe with Pyramid Head in Silent Hill, or outrunning waves of zombies, good horror games ensure that the player is uncomfortable and afraid of going further. But they have to go forward in the end, because even if every fiber of a person's being is shaking with fear, a great horror game will make a player want to walk down the dark hallway despite it all. And that's ultimately what makes great horror games great. That's it for this video. We hope you enjoyed looking at the different types of fear and how they are the difference between bad and great horror games. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this. And in the comments, let us know which horror games you enjoy and which ones you weren't scared by.